The year is 1425, and across the rolling hills of eastern France, morning mist rises from the Meuse River like the breath of sleeping giants. In the village of Domremy, church bells echo through valleys, where shepherds have guided their flocks for generations beyond memory, their bronze voices carrying across fields that know no peace. For this is a land caught between kingdoms, where the very air seems to shimmer with the tension of a war that has consumed the lives of grandfathers, fathers, and now threatens to claim their sons. Picture yourself walking through these ancient lanes, where thatched roofs huddle together against the uncertainty of each new dawn. The stones beneath your feet have been worn smooth by countless pilgrims journeying to the shrine of Our Lady of Vermont, their prayers rising like incense into skies that have witnessed century upon century of human struggle. Here, where the borders blur between the territories of France and the Holy Roman Empire, every sunrise brings fresh rumors of English victories, Burgundian raids, and French defeats that seem to push the legitimate King of France ever deeper into the shadows of his diminished realm. In this landscape of whispered fears and fading hopes, a 13-year-old girl named Joan moves through her daily tasks with the unhurried rhythm of rural life. You can see her now, guiding her father's sheep along paths that wind through meadows dotted with wildflowers, her bare feet sure on ground that her ancestors have worked since time beyond remembering. Her dark hair catches the early light as she pauses to count her charges, ensuring none have wandered toward the forest edge, where wolves still hunt and bandits still hide. The bells of St. Remy Church call across the fields, their familiar bronze voices marking the hours as they have for generations. But today, something different rides on the morning air. As Joan stands among her sheep, the ordinary world around her begins to shimmer with possibility. The very light seems to thicken, taking on qualities that no earthly illumination possesses, while the sounds of the village fade into a silence so profound it feels like the pause between heartbeats. From this supernatural quiet emerges a presence that transforms everything. The air itself becomes luminous, filled with a radiance that makes the summer sun seem pale by comparison. Through this divine light steps a figure of such majesty that Joan's knees buckle, though whether from fear or reverence she cannot tell. St. Michael the Archangel stands before her, his wings catching light that seems to come from within, rather than without, his voice carrying the authority of heaven itself, as he speaks words that will change the course of history. The sheep continue grazing, unaware that their young shepherd has become the recipient of a divine commission that will shake the very foundations of medieval Europe. To them, Joan appears merely to be standing still, her eyes fixed on empty air. But you can sense the magnitude of what unfolds in this moment when the invisible world breaks through the barriers of ordinary existence. The Archangel speaks of France's suffering, of a kingdom divided against itself, of a rightful king who waits in exile while foreign armies burn the villages of his people. As St. Michael's words wash over her, Joan experiences the overwhelming sensation of being chosen for something far beyond her understanding. The weight of divine purpose settles upon her shoulders like a mantle too heavy for human strength to bear, yet somehow she remains standing, anchored by a faith that runs deeper than conscious thought. The familiar landscape of her childhood takes on new meaning as the Archangel reveals that this peasant girl, unknown beyond the boundaries of her small village, has been selected to accomplish what the greatest knights and nobles of France have failed to achieve. The vision expands to include St. Margaret and St. Catherine, their presence adding layers of gentle authority to St. Michael's commanding voice. These holy women, martyrs who faced death rather than abandon their faith, speak to Joan with understanding that bridges the centuries between their earthly lives and this moment of divine revelation. Their words carry the wisdom of those who have walked through fire and emerged purified, offering guidance to one who must now begin her own journey through trials that will test every fiber of her being. When the vision fades and ordinary sight returns, Joan finds herself still standing in the meadow, her sheep scattered but safe, the bells of Saint Remy still calling across fields that look exactly as they did moments before. Yet everything has changed. The girl who bent to gather wildflowers that morning has become something new, marked by heaven for a destiny that will carry her from these peaceful fields to the throne rooms of kings, and the battlefields where the fate of nations hangs in the balance. The sun climbs higher, burning away the mist that had cloaked the valley, but within Joan's heart, a different kind of clarity takes root. She understands, with certainty that transcends rational thought, that her life of quiet service among her father's sheep has ended, replaced by a calling that will demand everything she possesses and more than she can imagine giving. The voices of the saints still echo in her memory, their words like seeds, planted in soil that has been prepared by years of simple faith and humble obedience. As she gathers her sheep and turns toward home, Joan carries within herself the beginning of a transformation that will astonish the world. The ordinary peasant girl walks back along familiar paths, but with each step, she moves closer to becoming the Maid of Orléans, the savior of France, the saint whose brief life will burn across history like a comet, illuminating the darkness of her age and inspiring generations yet unborn to believe that even the humblest soul, touched by divine grace, can change the world. The house where Joan returns each evening sits like countless others in Domremy, its stone walls thick enough to hold the warmth of hearth fires through the long winter months, its timber frame dark with age and weather. Within these walls lives Jacques d'Arc, a man whose calloused hands speak of decades spent working land that his father and grandfather worked before him. His wife, Isabelle Romy, moves through her daily tasks with the quiet strength of women who have learned to find peace within uncertainty, her prayers rising with the smoke from her cooking fire, her songs echoing softly as she spins wool into thread that will clothe her children through another harsh season. You can picture this family gathered around their simple wooden table as evening shadows lengthen across their single room, the faces illuminated by firelight, revealing the particular mixture of resilience and weariness that marks those who live on the edges of great events. Jacques speaks in measured tones about the day's work, the condition of their fields, the health of their livestock, but beneath his practical concerns runs an undercurrent of deeper worry. For Domremy exists in that dangerous space between competing loyalties, where villagers must navigate carefully between French and Burgundian sympathies, where a careless word spoken in the wrong company can bring armed men to your door. The 100 Years' War has carved deep wounds across this landscape, transforming fertile valleys into corridors of conflict where armies march and retreat according to patterns that ordinary people cannot predict or control. English longbowmen have walked these very paths, their yew bows strung and ready, while Burgundian cavalry has thundered across fields where children once played without fear. The war touches everything here, from the empty houses of families who fled south to the heightened watch kept from the church tower, where villagers take turns scanning horizons that might reveal friend or foe approaching through the morning mist. Joan listens to these adult conversations with the intensity of a child who has always felt the weight of the world more keenly than others her age. Even before the saints began speaking to her, she possessed that quality of deep attention that marks certain souls for unusual destinies. Her brothers, Pierre and Jean, accept their father's stories of distant battles and political maneuverings with the casual interest of boys who expect to spend their lives working the same fields their ancestors worked. But Joan absorbs every detail, every nuance, storing away information about the suffering of France as if she were already preparing for some great test. The visions return with increasing frequency as autumn deepens into winter. St. Michael appears to her not only in the fields but in the garden behind their house, in the quiet moments before dawn when she rises to help her mother with the morning tasks, even occasionally in the church during Mass, when the familiar Latin prayers seem to open doorways between the earthly and divine realms. Each appearance brings greater clarity about her mission, but also deeper understanding of the magnitude of what heaven asks of her. The archangel speaks to her of France as a living entity, wounded and bleeding, crying out for healing that only she can provide. He shows her visions of the rightful king, Charles, hiding in his court at Chinon, like a frightened child, while his kingdom dissolves around him. She sees English armies burning French villages, their banners bearing the 3 golden lions that have become symbols of foreign domination. Most painfully, she witnesses the spiritual desolation that accompanies military defeat, the way conquered peoples begin to doubt not only their earthly rulers, but the very justice of God. Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine elaborate on these themes with the gentle persistence of teachers guiding a beloved but struggling student. They explain that Joan's mission encompasses more than military victory, though armed conflict will certainly be required. She must restore not only French territorial sovereignty, but French confidence in divine providence. The kingdom suffers from a crisis of faith as much as a crisis of governance, and healing these wounds will require someone untainted by the compromises and failures that have brought France to its current desperate condition. As winter gives way to spring, Joan finds herself caught between 2 worlds that seem increasingly incompatible. During the day, she continues her life as a dutiful daughter, helping with household tasks, tending animals, participating in the rhythms of village life that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. But her nights belong to prayer and contemplation, to wrestling with questions that would challenge the greatest theologians of her age. How can an illiterate peasant girl advise kings and generals? How can someone who has never traveled beyond the nearby market towns navigate the treacherous politics of the royal court? The saints provide answers that satisfy her soul while challenging her reason. They explain that her very inexperience represents her greatest qualification, that her innocence of worldly corruption makes her a suitable vessel for divine purpose. They remind her that God has always chosen the humble to confound the mighty, the simple to shame the wise. Her lack of formal education becomes an advantage rather than a limitation, ensuring that the words she speaks will clearly come from heaven rather than human learning. Her family begins to notice changes in their youngest daughter that they cannot entirely explain. Joan has always been more devout than her siblings, more inclined to linger in church after services have ended, more likely to seek solitude for reflection and prayer. But now her devotion takes on qualities that both inspire and worry those who love her. She rises earlier to attend dawn mass, stays longer on her knees before the altar, speaks less during family meals, while her eyes hold depths that seem far older than her 14 years. When Joan finally attempts to share her experiences with her parents, their reactions reveal the gap between divine calling and human understanding that she will encounter throughout her brief public life. Jacques responds with the practical skepticism of a man who has seen too much human folly disguised as religious inspiration. The countryside holds many who claim special relationships with saints and angels, most of them harmless but deluded, some of them dangerous fanatics who lead their followers into disaster. His daughter's claims worry him not because he doubts her sincerity, but because he fears where such beliefs might lead her. Isabel's response reflects the more complex perspective of a woman whose own spiritual life runs deeper than conventional expressions might suggest. She recognizes something authentic in Joan's demeanor, something that transcends mere imagination or wishful thinking. Yet maternal love makes her reluctant to encourage visions that could take her daughter away from the safety and predictability of village life. The mother's heart understands that divine callings, even when genuine, often exact prices that human love finds difficult to accept. The tension between heavenly command and earthly attachment reaches its crisis point as Joan approaches her 15th birthday. The saints make clear that her time of preparation draws to a close, that soon she must begin the journey that will carry her away from everything familiar and safe. They speak with increasing urgency about the military situation, about English preparations for a final assault on Orléans that could end French resistance forever. Every day of delay, they warn, allows France's enemies to consolidate their advantages, while French morale continues its steady decline toward despair. Joan's internal struggle during these final months of her childhood reveals the profound humanity that will make her subsequent achievements so remarkable. She experiences all the normal fears of a young person facing an uncertain future, all the natural reluctance to leave behind the love and security of family life. The saints never minimize these feelings or suggest that answering God's call requires the suppression of human emotion. Instead, they teach her that courage consists not in the absence of fear, but in choosing to act rightly despite fear's presence. The decision, when it finally crystallizes, comes not through dramatic revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of certainty that marks genuine spiritual maturity. Joan realizes that her visions have prepared her not just with information about her mission, but with the inner strength necessary to pursue it. The frightened child who first trembled before St. Michael's awesome presence has grown into a young woman capable of bearing the weight of divine purpose without being crushed by its magnitude. As spring returns to Domremy in 1428, Joan makes her private resolution to approach Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the nearby fortress town of Vaucouleurs. The saints have shown her that this practical, worldly soldier represents her pathway from the realm of mystical experience into the harsh realities of political action. Through him, if God wills it, she will gain access to the Dauphin Charles and begin the work of saving France from the enemies that threaten to destroy not only its independence, but its very soul. The fortress of Vaucouleurs rises from rocky ground like a stone fist thrust against the sky, its walls blackened by decades of siege and storm, its towers crowned with iron spikes that catch the morning light like thorns. Within these formidable defenses, Robert de Baudricourt maintains his precarious authority over a region where loyalty shifts with each season's military fortunes. He represents that particular breed of frontier nobleman who has learned to survive through a combination of calculated pragmatism and careful neutrality, never committing fully to any cause that might cost him his lands or his life. Picture Joan as she approaches these gates for the first time in May of 1428, her heart hammering with the peculiar mixture of terror and determination that marks those moments when destiny calls us to step beyond the boundaries of our previous existence. She has walked the 12 miles from Domremy, accompanied by her uncle, Durand-Laxart, whose presence provides the necessary respectability for a young woman seeking audience with a military commander. Yet, even this small concession to propriety cannot disguise the audacious nature of her request or the impossible claims she prepares to make. Baudricourt receives them in the great hall of his castle, a space designed to intimidate petitioners and remind visitors of the vast gulf that separates noble authority from common presumption. The captain sits behind an oak table scarred by years of use, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts, as Joan begins to speak. Her words, delivered in the dialect of rural Lorraine, must sound to his ears like the ravings of a deluded peasant child. She claims divine authorization to save France, demands an escort to the Dauphin's court, insists that God himself has chosen her to accomplish what the greatest military minds of the age have failed to achieve. The nobleman's initial response combines amusement with irritation, the reaction of a practical man confronted with mystical nonsense that wastes his valuable time. He dismisses Joan with the crude suggestion that her father should box her ears and send her home where she belongs, but something in her demeanor prevents him from having her thrown bodily from his presence. Perhaps he recognizes in her unwavering certainty a quality that transcends mere delusion. Or perhaps he simply finds himself curious about this strange girl who speaks of saints and angels with the casual familiarity most people reserve for discussing neighbors and relatives. Joan returns to Vaucouleurs repeatedly throughout the summer and autumn, each visit wearing away another layer of Baudricourt's skepticism through the simple persistence of her presence. She finds lodging with Henri and Catherine Le Royer, a wheelwright and his wife who gradually become convinced of her authenticity through daily exposure to her character. Catherine later testifies that Joan spent her evenings in prayer rather than the gossip and games that typically occupy young women. that her devotion possessed qualities that distinguished it from mere conventional piety. As months pass, Joan's reputation begins to spread beyond Vaucouleurs through the network of travelers, merchants, and soldiers who carry news across the war-torn landscape of northeastern France. Stories emerge of predictions she has made about military events, of knowledge she possesses about developments in distant regions, despite her complete lack of access to normal sources of information. The saints have prepared her not only with a mission, but with the miraculous signs necessary to convince others of divine endorsement. The transformation in public opinion becomes visible during Joan's third major appeal to Baudricourt in January of 1429. This time she arrives to find the great hall filled with knights, merchants, and local nobles who have come specifically to hear the peasant girl who claims heaven has chosen her to save France. The audience listens with the intense attention reserved for entertainment that might prove either inspiring or catastrophic, but their initial amusement gradually gives way to something approaching awe as Joan demonstrates knowledge of recent French defeats that no village girl should possess. The crucial moment arrives when Joan provides Baudricourt with information about the Battle of Rouvray, fought on February 12th near Orléans, describing French losses before any official messenger could have carried news to Vaucouleurs. This demonstration of supernatural knowledge finally convinces the captain that he faces something beyond his experience or understanding. Whether Joan represents divine intervention or demonic deception, she clearly possesses abilities that transcend natural explanation, and in an age when the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds remain fluid, such manifestations demand serious consideration. Baudricourt's decision to grant Joan's request reflects not religious conviction, but political calculation mixed with superstitious caution. France's military situation has deteriorated to the point where conventional solutions appear inadequate, making even the most unlikely possibilities worth exploring. If this strange girl truly possesses divine favor, supporting her could bring unimaginable rewards. If she proves delusional, the responsibility for her failure will rest with the Dauphin's court rather than with the captain who merely forwarded her petition. The journey to Chinon begins on February 23, 1429, with Joan disguised in male clothing that transforms her from a peasant girl into a young pilgrim of indeterminate social status. Her companions include Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, two knights whose initial skepticism has gradually evolved into protective loyalty, along with their servants and a royal messenger, who provides official sanction for their passage through French territories. The party travels at night whenever possible, following routes that avoid known concentrations of English and Burgundian forces, while maintaining the rapid pace necessary to cross hostile territory before their presence can be detected and reported. Picture this small band moving through winter landscapes, where every shadow might conceal an enemy patrol, every village might harbor spies, ready to sell information about their movements to the highest bidder. The roads themselves tell stories of France's agony through the burned farmhouses that dot the countryside, the abandoned fields where weeds grow through what were once carefully tended furrows, the empty churches whose bells no longer call believers to prayer. Joan rides among these scenes of desolation with an expression that combines sorrow for her country's suffering with quiet confidence in its eventual redemption. The 11-day journey tests not only their physical endurance, but their faith in the enterprise that has brought them together. During the long hours of cold travel, Joan shares with her companions the details of her visions, describing St. Michael's appearance with the precise clarity of someone recounting conversations with living friends. Her matter-of-fact treatment of supernatural experiences gradually convinces even the most skeptical members of their party that they escort someone genuinely chosen for extraordinary purposes. They reach Chinon on March 6th as evening shadows begin to gather around the castle walls that rise from rocky heights above the Vienne River. The fortress represents everything that remains of legitimate French royal authority. its towers housing a court that has shrunk from the magnificent assemblies of earlier reigns to a desperate remnant of nobles who cling to increasingly fragile hopes for their kingdom's survival. Within these walls, the Dauphin maintains the forms of kingship, while lacking either the resources or the confidence necessary to make those forms meaningful. Joan's arrival creates immediate controversy within a court already divided by competing factions and conflicting strategies. Some courtiers view her as a heaven-sent solution to problems that have proven beyond human resolution, while others see her as either a dangerous fanatic or a Burgundian agent sent to complete France's destruction through subterfuge. The theological implications of her claims particularly trouble learned clerics, who understand that accepting her divine mission would require acknowledging that God has chosen to communicate through channels outside official church hierarchy. The famous test that follows represents more than royal caution. It constitutes a crucial moment when spiritual authority confronts temporal power, under circumstances that will determine their future relationship. Charles arranges for one of his courtiers to assume royal dress and position, while he himself mingles anonymously among the assembled nobles, creating a scenario designed to expose any deception in Joan's supernatural claims. The great hall fills with torch smoke and whispered speculation, as everyone present prepares to witness either a miracle or an embarrassing failure. Joan enters this charged atmosphere with the calm certainty of someone whose eyes have been opened to realities invisible to normal perception. Without hesitation, she moves through the crowd of richly dressed nobles, directly to the simply clothed figure of Charles, kneeling before him with words that transform the entire proceedings from theatrical test to religious revelation. Her recognition of the disguised king provides the first public demonstration of her supernatural gifts, but her private conversation with him delivers the decisive proof that will determine France's future. The content of their private discussion remains one of history's most closely guarded secrets, but its effects become immediately visible in Charles's transformed demeanor. The uncertain young man, who had hidden among his courtiers, emerges from their conversation as someone prepared to stake his crown and kingdom on the word of a peasant girl from Lorraine. Joan has apparently shared knowledge about his most private doubts and fears, knowledge that no earthly intelligence could have provided, convincing him beyond any possibility of doubt that heaven has indeed intervened in France's desperate hour. The theological examination at Poitiers follows as a necessary formality, though its importance for establishing Joan's credibility throughout Christendom cannot be understated. For 3 weeks, learned doctors of theology subject her to questioning designed to detect any trace of heretical belief or demonic influence, probing her understanding of church doctrine and her interpretation of her own supernatural experiences. Joan's responses reveal not scholarly learning, but the deep wisdom that flows from authentic spiritual experience, impressing her examiners with insights that transcend formal education while remaining perfectly orthodox in their fundamental orientation. The verdict from Poitiers arrives like sunlight breaking through storm clouds that have darkened France for generations. The assembled theologians, men whose learning encompasses the accumulated wisdom of centuries, declare Joan free from any taint of heresy or demonic influence. Their formal pronouncement echoes through the corridors of Chinon with the weight of divine validation, transforming a peasant girl's extraordinary claims into official recognition that heaven has indeed chosen to intervene in earthly affairs through the most unlikely of instruments. You can sense the transformation that begins to work within the royal court as news of the theological approval spreads from chamber to chamber, breathing new life into hopes that had withered under the relentless pressure of military defeat and political fragmentation. Nobles who had whispered skeptically about the strange girl from Domremy now speak of her with the reverence reserved for those marked by divine favor. The Dauphin, Charles, whose confidence has been shattered by years of retreat and compromise, begins to carry himself with something approaching royal dignity as he contemplates the possibility that God has finally answered France's desperate prayers. Joan herself remains remarkably unchanged by this sudden elevation in status, maintaining the same mixture of humility and quiet certainty that characterized her demeanor during the long months of seeking recognition. Yet those who observe her closely notice subtle alterations in her bearing, as if the official acknowledgement of her mission has activated dormant aspects of her personality that were always present but previously hidden. The shy peasant girl who once trembled before St. Michael's awesome presence has begun to evolve into someone capable of commanding armies and counseling kings without losing the essential simplicity that makes her divine favor credible. The first tangible sign of her transformation emerges through the question of appropriate clothing for someone who must function simultaneously as maiden and military commander. The court solution creates something entirely new in the experience of medieval warfare, a suit of white armor crafted specifically for Joan's feminine form, its gleaming plates designed to protect without concealing the essential femininity that legitimizes her extraordinary role. The metal itself seems to glow with an inner light as court artisans work by candlelight, hammering and shaping steel that will soon carry divine purpose into the heart of human conflict. Picture Joan as she first dons this remarkable armor, feeling the weight of steel settle across her shoulders like a physical manifestation of the responsibility heaven has placed upon her. The breastplate bears engravings of religious symbols that transform military equipment into something approaching liturgical vestments, while the helmet's design allows her long hair to flow freely, maintaining the visual reminder that God has chosen to work through feminine grace rather than masculine force. Each piece fits with uncanny precision, as if the armor has been waiting throughout eternity for this particular wearer to claim it. The creation of her banner requires even more careful consideration, for this textile will serve as the visible symbol of her divine authorization before armies that have learned to read meaning in every detail of military heraldry. Joan works closely with court artists to design an image that captures the essence of her mission without descending into mere decoration. The white silk background, pure as fresh snow, provides the foundation for representations that bridge earthly and heavenly authority. At the center, the figure of Christ in majesty holds dominion over all earthly kingdoms, while flanking angels offer lilies that represent both French royal authority and the purity that legitimizes Joan's unprecedented role. The banner's inscription presents its own theological challenges, requiring words that proclaim divine authority without falling into presumption or heresy. The final choice, Jesus Mary, captures perfectly the dual nature of Joan's mission: devotion to Christ that manifests through the intercession of the Virgin, who understands both divine purpose and human suffering. These names, embroidered in golden thread that catches torchlight like captured sunbeams, will precede Joan into every battle she fights, serving as both inspiration for her followers and terror for her enemies. But the most remarkable element of Joan's transformation involves a sword that exists more in legend than in immediate reality. The saints have revealed to her the location of an ancient blade hidden beneath the altar of Saint Catherine de Fierbois, a church dedicated to one of her divine guides that lies along the pilgrimage route to Tours. No living person has seen this weapon, yet Joan describes its appearance with the precise detail of someone who has handled it personally. 5 crosses, etched into the steel, rust that will fall away at first touch, a blade that has waited centuries for the hand destined to wield it. The expedition to retrieve this miraculous sword becomes a pilgrimage that draws participants from across the remnant of free France. Knights who have lost faith in earthly victory join merchants whose goods have been plundered by English raiders, while clergy who have seen their churches burned participate alongside peasants whose fields lie fallow under foreign occupation. They converge on Saint Catherine de Fierbois with the desperate hope of those who have exhausted all conventional remedies and now stake everything on divine intervention. The discovery unfolds exactly as Joan predicted, with the sword lying precisely where her visions indicated. Its condition matching her supernatural description in every detail. As her hands close around the grip, centuries of accumulated rust crumble away to reveal steel that gleams with the brilliance of freshly forged metal. The weapon feels perfectly balanced in her grasp, as if it has been waiting throughout the ages for this moment of reunion between blade and destined bearer. Those present witness not merely the recovery of an ancient relic, but the physical manifestation of Joan's divine authorization. Word of the miraculous sword spreads across war-torn France with the speed that attends genuinely supernatural events, carrying news that revives hopes that had seemed permanently extinguished. In villages where people have learned to hide at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, families gather round their hearth fires to whisper stories of the maiden who has been chosen by heaven to drive out the invaders. In castles where French nobles have accepted English overlordship as the price of survival, conversations begin to turn toward the possibility of renewed resistance. The military preparations at Chinon reflect this transformation of national mood from despair to desperate hope. Soldiers who had served primarily as castle guards find themselves preparing for offensive operations that require skills they had almost forgotten. Armorers work through the night to repair equipment that had been allowed to deteriorate during the long period of French military paralysis, while grooms ready horses for campaigns that will demand endurance and speed rather than the short-range mobility needed for defensive operations. Joan moves through this bustle of preparation with an authority that astonishes everyone who observes it. Despite her complete lack of formal military training, she demonstrates intuitive understanding of logistics and strategy that seasoned commanders struggle to match. She discusses the condition of equipment with the knowledge of someone who has spent years maintaining weapons and armor, while her conversations about troop movements reveal grasp of tactical principles that she could never have learned in the peaceful villages of Lorraine. Most remarkable of all is the effect her presence has on the soldiers who will serve under her command. These are men hardened by years of defeat and retreat, whose loyalty has been tested beyond normal limits by the seemingly endless succession of French military disasters. Yet something in Joan's demeanor awakens responses that they thought had died under the weight of accumulated failure. They find themselves standing straighter in her presence, speaking with confidence about operations they would have considered hopeless weeks earlier. The final element of Joan's transformation involves accepting the complex position she will occupy within medieval military hierarchy. As a woman, she cannot officially hold military rank. Yet, as God's chosen instrument, she must exercise authority over men whose noble birth would normally place them far above her station. The solution emerges through a title that has never existed before, the Maid of Orleans, a designation that acknowledges both her divine mission and her feminine identity while granting her the practical authority necessary to fulfill heaven's commands. As spring deepens toward summer, Joan's metamorphosis from peasant to prophet reaches completion. The girl who once tended sheep in the meadows of Domremy has become someone capable of inspiring armies and commanding the respect of kings. Yet she retains the essential humility that makes her divine favor credible. She stands ready to lead France's last desperate gamble against enemies who have dominated the battlefield for generations, armed with nothing more substantial than unshakable faith and the promise that God fights on the side of justice. The white armor gleams in the morning light as Joan prepares to ride toward Orleans, where English siege engines have hammered French defenses for months, while the city's desperate inhabitants pray for relief that conventional military wisdom insists cannot come. Yet she rides with the quiet confidence of someone who has seen beyond the veil that separates earthly possibility from divine power, knowing that the battle ahead will be won not through superior numbers or tactical brilliance, but through the simple truth that heaven has finally chosen to answer France's prayers. The road to Orléans stretches across countryside that bears the scars of a kingdom at war with itself, each mile revealing fresh evidence of the English siege that has transformed this vital city from a symbol of French resistance into a desperate bastion whose fall would signal the final collapse of legitimate royal authority. Picture yourself riding alongside Joan's small army as they approach the Loire Valley, where smoke from English campfires mingles with the morning mist that rises from the great river, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and the promise of decisive action. The strategic importance of Orléans extends far beyond its impressive walls and prosperous merchants' houses, for this city controls the crucial bridge that allows armies to cross the Loire and advance into the heart of France. If these defenses fall to English assault, nothing will prevent the invaders from marching directly to Bourges and Poitiers, completing the conquest that began with Henry V's invasion and continued through decades of French military humiliation. The city represents more than stone and mortar. It embodies the last, flickering hope that France might yet emerge from the darkness that has engulfed it since the disaster at Agincourt. Joan's approach to this besieged stronghold reveals the supernatural confidence that marks every aspect of her divine mission. While experienced military commanders would normally spend weeks developing elaborate plans for breaking such a formidable siege, she rides forward with the serene certainty of someone who has already seen the outcome written in heaven's eternal plans. Her white armor catches the spring sunlight like polished silver, while her banner bearing the sacred names of Jesus and Mary streams in the wind that carries the sounds of distant combat toward her advancing column. The English siege works that surround Orléans represent the pinnacle of medieval military engineering, a complex network of fortified positions that the invaders call boulevards, each designed to control specific approaches to the city while protecting the besiegers from French sorties. These earthwork fortresses, connected by trenches and protected by sharpened stakes, have transformed the countryside around Orléans into a maze of defensive positions that would challenge even the most experienced assault forces. From these strongholds, English archers can rain arrows upon any French attempt to break the siege, while their cannon can pummel the city walls with stone balls that have already opened several promising breaches. The most formidable of these English positions stands on the south bank of the Loire, where the fortress called Les Tourelles guards the bridge that connects Orléans to the territories that remain under French control. This massive stone structure, reinforced with earth and timber, bristles with artillery that can sweep the river approach with devastating crossfire. English banners, bearing the 3 golden lions of their royal arms, flutter from its towers like proclamations of inevitable victory, while the garrison maintains constant vigilance against French attempts to recapture this crucial strongpoint. Yet the true measure of Orléans' desperate situation becomes visible not in English strength, but in French weakness. As Joan observes during her first reconnaissance of the besieged city, the defending forces, commanded by Jean d'Orléans, the bastard of Orléans, have been reduced by months of attrition to a mere shadow of their original strength. Food supplies run dangerously low, despite attempts to smuggle provisions through English lines, while ammunition for the city's artillery has dwindled to the point where each shot must be carefully rationed. Most critically, the morale of both soldiers and civilians has eroded under the constant pressure of bombardment and the growing certainty that no relief force possesses sufficient strength to break the English stranglehold. Joan's arrival at the city walls on April 29, 1429, transforms this atmosphere of despair with the speed and thoroughness that characterizes genuinely miraculous interventions. Word of her approach spreads through the narrow streets of Orléans like wildfire, drawing crowds of desperate citizens to the ramparts, where they can witness the fulfillment of prophecies they had scarcely dared to believe. Here rides the maiden whom heaven has chosen to save France, her white armor gleaming with divine favor, her sacred banner proclaiming that God himself marches with the defenders of this crucial stronghold. The bastard of Orléans greets Joan with the mixture of hope and skepticism that marks a professional soldier's response to claims that transcend military experience. This illegitimate son of the royal house has spent his adult life mastering the harsh realities of medieval warfare, learning through bitter experience that battles are won through superior numbers, better equipment, and tactical skill, rather than divine intervention. Yet something in Joan's presence convinces him that conventional wisdom may prove inadequate to the extraordinary circumstances that have brought them together. Their first council of war reveals the depth of transformation that Joan's arrival has wrought within the French command structure. Officers who had spent months discussing various strategies for prolonging their resistance now find themselves planning offensive operations that would have seemed suicidal during the dark days before her coming. Joan listens to their reports with the intense attention of someone receiving crucial intelligence. But her responses reveal understanding of siege warfare that no village girl should possess. She speaks knowledgeably about artillery placement, supply lines, and the psychological factors that determine victory or defeat in prolonged military operations. Her first major decision demonstrates the audacity that will characterize all her subsequent military actions. Rather than beginning with probing attacks designed to test English defenses, Joan insists on launching an immediate assault against the boulevard of Les Tourelles, the strongest position in the entire English siege network. Her reasoning transcends normal tactical considerations, resting instead on the divine assurance that God has already determined the outcome of their struggle. The English stronghold represents not merely a military obstacle, but a symbol of foreign domination that must be destroyed through dramatic action rather than cautious maneuvering. The assault begins before dawn on May 4th, with Joan leading a force that combines professional soldiers with civilian volunteers whose enthusiasm compensates for their lack of military training. Picture this strange army advancing through the morning darkness, their footsteps muffled by grass still wet with dew, their weapons gleaming faintly in the light of torches that illuminate Joan's banner as it moves steadily toward the English fortifications. The very air seems charged with supernatural energy as heaven's chosen maiden leads France's last hope against enemies who have dominated every battlefield for generations. The initial attacks against the English boulevards succeed beyond all rational expectation, with French forces overrunning defensive positions that had resisted every previous assault. Joan's presence transforms ordinary soldiers into heroes, willing to face odds that would normally guarantee defeat, while her banner serves as a rallying point that draws scattered units into coordinated action. English archers, whose longbows have decided the fate of nations, find their deadly accuracy disrupted by some inexplicable force that seems to deflect their arrows away from the advancing French troops. Yet the true test of Joan's divine mission comes during the climactic assault on Les Tourelles, where English commander William Glassdale has concentrated his finest troops behind fortifications that represent the pinnacle of military engineering. The massive walls rise from the Loire's waters like cliffs of worked stone, their surfaces scarred by previous French attacks, but showing no sign of serious damage. English cannon mounted on the ramparts can sweep the narrow approaches with fire that should make any assault attempt nothing more than elaborate suicide. Joan leads the advance personally, her white armor making her a conspicuous target for every English archer within range, yet she moves through the storm of arrows and crossbow bolts as if protected by invisible shields. Her voice carries above the din of combat, shouting encouragement to her followers, while calling upon her divine guides for continued protection. St. Michael's presence seems almost tangible in the space around her, deflecting death away from God's chosen instrument while she accomplishes the impossible task heaven has assigned to her. The crucial moment arrives when a crossbow bolt, fired from the English walls, pierces Joan's shoulder just above her breastplate, sending her tumbling backward with blood streaming down her white armor. The sight of their divinely protected leader, wounded and apparently dying, sends a shockwave through the French assault force that threatens to transform victory into catastrophic defeat. English defenders, sensing their opportunity, prepare to launch the counterattack that will drive the French back across the Loire and restore their siege to its previous effectiveness. But Joan's response to her wounding demonstrates the supernatural resilience that marks her entire career. Rather than withdrawing to seek medical attention, she pulls the iron bolt from her own shoulder, stanches the bleeding with a mixture of olive oil and lard, and returns to the assault with renewed determination. Her reappearance before the walls of Les Tourelles wounded but undaunted, inspires her followers to levels of heroism that transcend normal human capability, while striking terror into English hearts that had begun to celebrate premature victory. The final assault on Les Tourelles unfolds with the terrible beauty of divine justice made manifest through human action. French siege ladders reach the English walls despite artillery fire that should have shattered them to kindling, while Joan's banner waves from the ramparts as her followers pour through breaches that seem to open of their own accord. William Glassdale himself falls into the Loire while attempting to escape across a burning bridge, his death serving as a symbol of English hopes drowning in the dark waters that have witnessed this miraculous reversal of fortune. The psychological impact of L'Étoile's fall spreads through the English siege lines like plague, undermining confidence that had been built through years of uninterrupted victory. Soldiers who had considered themselves invincible begin to whisper about the supernatural forces arrayed against them, while their commanders struggle to maintain discipline among troops who no longer believe in the inevitability of their success. The white-armored maiden who fights under heaven's direct protection has shattered more than stone fortifications. She has broken the spell of English invincibility that has paralyzed French resistance for generations. As news of the great victory reaches the citizens of Orléans, the city erupts in celebrations that combine military triumph with religious ecstasy. Church bells that had been silent for months ring out across the Loire Valley, their bronze voices proclaiming that God has finally answered France's desperate prayers. In the Cathedral of Sainte-Croix, spontaneous masses of thanksgiving draw crowds that overflow into the surrounding streets, where people kneel on cobblestones to offer prayers of gratitude for deliverance that surpasses human understanding. Yet Joan herself remains remarkably unchanged by this stunning success, accepting the praise of grateful citizens with the same humility she had shown during her obscure life in Domremy. She understands that the victory at Les Tourelles represents only the beginning of her mission, that heaven's plan for France extends far beyond the relief of a single besieged city. The English army still occupies vast territories throughout the kingdom, while the Dauphin Charles remains uncrowned and therefore incomplete in his royal authority. The English withdrawal from Orléans on May 8, 1429, marks more than the end of a siege. It signals the beginning of a new phase in the 100 Years' War, where French forces will take the offensive for the first time in generations. As the invaders abandoned their elaborate siege works and retreat toward their bases in English-controlled territory, they leave behind not only military equipment, but the psychological dominance that had made their previous victories seem inevitable. Joan stands on the walls of liberated Orléans as the last English soldiers disappear into the distance, her white armor stained with the honest blood of victory, her banner streaming triumphantly in the wind that carries the scent of spring flowers across battlefields where French hopes have been reborn. The peasant girl who received her first divine vision in the meadows of Domremy has become the Maid of Orléans, savior of the city whose survival ensures that France itself will live to fight another day. The smoke still rises from the abandoned English siege works around Orléans when Joan turns her attention to the greater strategic picture that her divine guides have revealed in visions no earthly commander could possess. While the citizens of the liberated city celebrate their miraculous deliverance with processions and thanksgiving masses, she studies maps that show the network of English-held fortresses stretching along the Loire Valley like a chain of iron links designed to strangle French resistance at its source. These strongholds represent more than mere military positions. They constitute the foundation of English dominance in central France, and their continued existence ensures that the victory at Orléans remains an isolated triumph rather than the beginning of genuine liberation. You can picture Joan as she stands in the Great Hall of Orléans, her finger tracing the river's course on parchment maps that reveal the scope of the task heaven has assigned to her. Each mark represents a fortified town where English garrisons maintain their grip on territories that rightfully belong to the Crown of France, their banners flying in defiance of divine justice, while their soldiers collect taxes and tribute from French peasants who have learned to accept foreign domination as the price of survival. The mathematical precision of English strategy becomes visible in these carefully positioned strongholds, each one placed to support its neighbors while controlling crucial river crossings and supply routes. Her military council, comprised of veterans whose experience spans decades of French defeats, listens with growing amazement as Joan outlines an offensive strategy that would have seemed impossible during the dark months before her arrival. Where conventional wisdom demands careful consolidation of gains and methodical preparation for limited objectives, she proposes a lightning campaign designed to clear the entire Loire Valley within a matter of weeks. Her reasoning transcends normal tactical considerations, resting instead on the divine assurance that God has already determined the outcome of their struggle and requires only swift human action to manifest his will through earthly events. The first target in this audacious campaign reveals Joan's intuitive understanding of medieval warfare's psychological dimensions. Rather than attacking the nearest English position, she chooses to assault Jargeau, a heavily fortified town whose capture would place a vital English commander within French hands. The Earl of Suffolk, one of England's most capable military leaders, has established his headquarters within the walls of Jargeau, making the town a symbol of English authority that extends far beyond its immediate strategic value. His capture would demonstrate to friend and foe alike that heaven's favor has shifted decisively toward the French cause. The march to Jargeau unfolds through countryside that shows the first signs of recovery from the paralysis that had gripped this region during the long months of English dominance. French soldiers who had learned to move cautiously through hostile territory now advance with the confidence of men who march under divine protection, their voices raised in hymns that echo across fields where spring crops grow unmolested for the first time in years. Joan rides among them in her gleaming white armor, her sacred banner streaming in the wind that carries the scent of apple blossoms and the promise of renewal. The siege of Jargeau demonstrates Joan's remarkable ability to adapt divine inspiration to the practical requirements of medieval warfare. Unlike the desperate assault that characterized the fighting at Orléans, this operation proceeds with methodical efficiency that combines supernatural confidence with sound military planning. French engineers position their cannon with precision that maximizes the impact of each shot, while infantry units coordinate their movements with the skill of veterans who have rediscovered their professional competence under inspired leadership. Yet the crucial element in Jargeau's fall remains the inexplicable demoralization that afflicts English defenders when confronted by Joan's presence on the battlefield. These are soldiers who have dominated French armies for generations, men whose confidence in their own superiority has been reinforced by countless victories won through tactical skill and disciplined courage. But something about the white-armored maiden who fights under heaven's direct protection undermines their psychological foundations, introducing doubt into minds that had never questioned their inevitable triumph. The assault on Jargeau's walls provides the most dramatic demonstration yet of Joan's supernatural protection from harm. English archers, whose longbows have decided the fate of kingdoms, find their arrows deflected by forces that transcend physical explanation, while crossbow bolts, aimed directly at her white-armored figure, somehow miss their mark, despite the close range that should guarantee accurate shooting. She moves through the storm of projectiles as if walking through summer rain, her voice carrying above the din of combat as she encourages her followers to climb the siege ladders that lean against Jargeau's ancient stones. The capture of the Earl of Suffolk represents more than a valuable prisoner exchange. It constitutes visible proof that English nobility enjoys no special protection from the divine justice that flows through Joan's military campaigns. This seasoned commander, whose tactical brilliance has contributed to decades of French humiliation, finds himself helpless before forces that operate according to laws higher than those governing normal warfare. His surrender, negotiated through the courtly protocols that govern noble warfare, provides French diplomats with a bargaining chip whose value extends far beyond mere monetary considerations. but Joan allows little time for celebration before turning her attention to the next objective in her systematic destruction of English power along the Loire. The fortress of Mont-sur-Loire sits astride the river like a stone sentinel, its towers commanding the waterway that serves as the principal supply route for English forces operating throughout central France. The speed with which Joan's army moves from Jargeau to Meung demonstrates her understanding that success in this campaign depends upon maintaining momentum that prevents English commanders from coordinating their defensive efforts. The siege of Meung reveals new dimensions of Joan's tactical genius as she adapts her methods to the specific challenges posed by each English stronghold. Where Jargeau had fallen to direct assault, Meung's river-based defenses require a more sophisticated approach that combines land and water operations. French engineers construct floating bridges that allow infantry to approach the fortress from unexpected directions, while cavalry units sweep through the surrounding countryside to cut supply lines that connect Meung to other English positions. The psychological warfare that accompanies these military operations proves as decisive as the physical combat itself. Stories of Joan's miraculous protection and divine mission spread through English ranks with the speed that attends genuinely supernatural phenomena, undermining confidence in commanders who can offer no explanation for the string of French victories that began at Orléans. Soldiers who had considered themselves invincible begin to whisper about forces beyond human understanding, while their officers struggle to maintain discipline among troops who no longer believe in the inevitability of their success. The swift capture of Meung-sur-Loire opens the next phase of Joan's campaign, as French forces advance with gathering momentum toward Beaugency, another fortress whose fall would further fragment English control over the Loire Valley. The speed of these successive victories creates a psychological avalanche that threatens to bury English morale beneath an accumulation of defeats that conventional military wisdom insists should be impossible. Each fallen stronghold makes the next target more vulnerable, not merely through strategic isolation, but through the growing conviction that divine justice has finally turned against the invaders. Beaugency's siege demonstrates the complete transformation that Joan's presence has wrought within the French military establishment. Officers who had spent years developing elaborate plans for limited objectives now coordinate complex operations with the efficiency of men who know their efforts enjoy heaven's blessing. Artillery crews service their cannon with precision that maximizes the destructive impact of each shot, while infantry units advance with the disciplined courage of soldiers who march under supernatural protection. The surrender of Beaugency after minimal resistance reveals the extent to which English morale has deteriorated under the relentless pressure of Joan's offensive. Garrison commanders who might have held out for weeks against conventional assault choose instead to negotiate terms that allow them to withdraw with their honor intact rather than face the inexplicable forces that seem to operate through the white armored maiden. Their pragmatic acceptance of defeat signals a fundamental shift in the strategic balance that has governed the 100 Years' War since its earliest phases. Yet the greatest triumph of Joan's Loire campaign awaits at Patay, where English forces make their final attempt to halt the French advance through conventional military action. Sir John Fastolf, one of England's most experienced commanders, assembles a substantial army drawn from garrisons throughout the region, deploying his forces according to tactical principles that have ensured English victory on countless previous battlefields. His strategy relies heavily on the longbow superiority that has characterized English warfare since the great victories of Crécy and Poitiers, positioning his archers behind defensive stakes where they can rain death upon any French cavalry charge. The Battle of Patay unfolds with the terrible swiftness that marks encounters where divine intervention overwhelms human planning. French scouts, guided by supernatural insight that transcends normal military intelligence, locate the English position before Fastolf's forces can complete their defensive preparations. Joan leads the cavalry charge that strikes the English army while their archers still struggle to organize their defensive formation, transforming what should have been a methodical engagement into a rout that destroys English military prestige throughout central France. Picture the battlefield at Patay as French knights thunder across the open ground, their lances lowered and their battle cries echoing across fields that witness the reversal of centuries of English dominance. Joan rides at their head in her gleaming white armor, her sacred banner streaming above the charge that breaks English power like a hammer shattering glass. The legendary longbowmen who have decided the fate of nations find themselves overwhelmed before they can employ the tactical advantages that have made them masters of European battlefields. The speed and completeness of the English defeat at Patay sends shockwaves throughout both kingdoms, as news of the battle spreads along the networks of communication that carry intelligence across medieval Europe. In London, King Henry's councillors struggle to comprehend how their seemingly invincible armies have suffered such catastrophic reverses at the hands of forces led by a peasant girl whose very existence challenges their understanding of warfare and divine justice. In Paris, Burgundian allies begin to reconsider their allegiance to the English cause as reports arrive describing supernatural interventions that transcend normal military explanation. The French casualties at Patay number fewer than 30 men, while English losses exceed 2,000, creating a mathematical impossibility that serves as visible proof of divine favor shifting from one side to the other. Such lopsided results cannot be explained through conventional military analysis, forcing observers to acknowledge that forces beyond human understanding have entered the conflict on behalf of French claims to legitimacy. The white-armored maiden who fights under heaven's direct protection has shattered more than English armies. She has broken the psychological foundations upon which their empire of conquest was built. As Joan surveys the battlefield, where English power in central France lies broken and scattered, she understands that the road to Reims now lies open before the army that marches under divine protection. The network of fortresses that had strangled French resistance along the Loire Valley has been systematically dismantled through a campaign that combined supernatural inspiration with sound military execution. English commanders who had seemed invincible just months earlier now retreat toward their remaining strongholds, their confidence shattered by encounters with forces that operate according to laws higher than those governing earthly warfare. The Loire campaign concludes with French forces in possession of strategic initiative for the first time in generations, their morale transformed from despair to confident expectation of continued victory. Joan's banner has become a symbol of divine favor that inspires French soldiers while striking terror into English hearts, reversing the psychological dynamics that had maintained foreign domination for decades. The peasant girl who received her first visions in the meadows of Domremy has become the architect of military revolution that opens new possibilities for French independence and royal legitimacy. The dust settles over the field at Patay, carrying with it the remnants of English dominance that had seemed as permanent as the stones beneath ancient cathedral walls. Yet Joan's eyes already look beyond this crushing victory, toward an objective that transcends mere military conquest. For the saints have shown her that France's salvation requires more than battlefield success. The crown that legitimizes royal authority awaits in the cathedral city of Reims, where French kings have received divine sanction for their earthly rule since Clovis first knelt before Christian altars, 14 centuries before this moment of destiny. Picture the war council that convenes in the aftermath of Patay's triumph, where seasoned commanders who have spent their careers thinking in terms of tactical advantage struggle to comprehend Joan's strategic vision. While conventional military wisdom would demand consolidation of recent gains and careful preparation for the next phase of operations, she proposes something that seems to transcend rational planning: a direct march through hostile territory toward a city that lies deep within regions controlled by Burgundian forces allied with England's cause. The audacity of her proposal reveals the extent to which divine guidance operates according to principles that earthly understanding cannot fully grasp. Reims sits more than 100 miles from their current position, separated by territories where English and Burgundian garrisons maintained their grip on strategic fortresses and market towns. Any conventional army attempting such a march would face coordinated resistance from enemies who enjoy the advantages of interior lines and familiar terrain. Yet Joan speaks of this expedition with the calm certainty of someone describing a familiar journey rather than a desperate gamble. Her reasoning rests on insights that flow from sources beyond human intelligence, for the saints have revealed to her the psychological transformation that will accompany the Dauphin's coronation in the proper cathedral, performed with ancient rituals that connect earthly kingship to divine authority. Charles remains incomplete in his royal dignity so long as he lacks the sacred anointing that distinguishes legitimate monarchs from mere political leaders, and this deficiency undermines French resistance more thoroughly than any military defeat could accomplish. The march toward Reims begins in early July of 1429, with Joan's army moving through countryside that shows increasing signs of prosperity as they advance into regions where Burgundian administration has maintained better order than the chaos that characterizes English-occupied territories. The very landscape seems to respond to their approach, with summer fields heavy with grain that will feed the army of liberation, while villages emerge from their defensive shells to welcome soldiers who march under banners that proclaim divine favor rather than foreign conquest. Yet the true miracle of this audacious expedition emerges not through military action, but through the extraordinary series of bloodless surrenders that mark their progress toward the coronation city. Town after town opens its gates before Joan's approaching forces, their governors and military commanders choosing submission over resistance after witnessing the supernatural events that have transformed French military fortunes. The white-armored maiden who rides at the head of this advancing column has become a legend whose reputation precedes her arrival, making further resistance seem not merely futile, but impious. The first major test of this strategy comes at Auxerre, where Burgundian officials must choose between loyalty to their English allies and accommodation with forces that appear to enjoy heaven's direct protection. Picture the debate that rages within the city's council chambers as reports arrive describing Joan's miraculous victories and the inexplicable demoralization that afflicts all who oppose her divine mission. The pragmatic arguments that favor submission gradually overcome the political considerations that demand continued resistance, leading to negotiations that allow the French army to pass through Burgundian territory without the bloodshed that conventional warfare would require. The surrender of Auxerre establishes a pattern that repeats itself as Joan's forces continue their advance toward Reims, with each successive capitulation making the next target more vulnerable to psychological pressure. News of these peaceful conquests spreads through the communication networks that connect medieval Europe, carrying stories of supernatural interventions that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of political authority and divine justice. The peasant girl who claims heaven's authorization has begun to reshape the political map of France through means that transcend conventional military action. Troyes presents a more formidable challenge, for this wealthy commercial center has invested heavily in its Burgundian allegiances and cannot easily abandon commitments that have brought prosperity to its merchant classes. The city's walls rise from surrounding plains like monuments to human defiance, their towers bristling with artillery that could exact a terrible price from any assault force. Yet something in Joan's approach undermines the confidence of defenders, who had prepared for conventional siege warfare rather than encounters with forces that operate according to supernatural principles. The negotiations that lead to Troyes' surrender reveal Joan's remarkable ability to combine divine inspiration with practical diplomacy, as she addresses the city's representatives with arguments that appeal simultaneously to their spiritual convictions and their material interests. Her words carry the authority of someone who speaks not merely as a military commander, but as heaven's chosen instrument, offering terms that acknowledge earthly realities while proclaiming the ultimate supremacy of divine justice over human political arrangements. The psychological impact of Toye's capitulation resonates throughout the remaining Burgundian territories that lie between Joan's army and their destination. For this commercial centre's submission demonstrates that even the most committed opponents of French royal authority cannot resist the supernatural forces that flow through the May's mission. Merchants who had prospered under Burgundian protection begin to recalculate their allegiances, while military commanders who had sworn oaths to English overlords find themselves questioning loyalties that seemed unshakable before Joan's arrival transformed the strategic landscape. Chalon-in-Champagne falls without resistance, its gates opening to welcome an army whose reputation has grown with each peaceful conquest along the road to Reims. The speed of these successive surrenders creates momentum that seems to draw the French forces forward through sheer gravitational pull, as if destiny itself has become a tangible force that shapes events according to patterns invisible to ordinary perception. Joan rides through these submissive cities in her gleaming white armor, her sacred banner proclaiming divine favor, while her presence transforms political calculations throughout northeastern France. The final approach to Reims unfolds through countryside where Gothic spires pierce summer skies like prayers made visible in stone and mortar. The great cathedral that awaits their arrival represents more than architectural achievement. It embodies the sacred traditions that connect French kingship to divine sanction, its altars sanctified by centuries of royal coronations that have transformed earthly rulers into anointed representatives of heavenly authority. Within these hallowed walls, the Dauphin Charles will undergo the mystical transformation that completes Joan's mission while establishing the foundation for French independence. Reims itself surrenders before Joan's army reaches its ancient walls, the city's leaders choosing to embrace their role in providential history rather than resist forces they recognize as instruments of divine will. Picture the procession that enters this holy city on July 16, 1429, with Joan riding at the head of an army that has accomplished the impossible through means that transcend human understanding. Her white armor gleams in the afternoon sunlight, while her banner streams above crowds that gather to witness the fulfillment of prophecies they had scarcely dared to believe. The preparations for the coronation ceremony reveal the profound significance that medieval minds attach to rituals that bridge earthly and heavenly authority. Within the cathedral of Notre-Dame de Reims, where Clovis first received Christian kingship and where Charlemagne knelt before papal representatives, ancient traditions prepare to work their transformative power upon a prince whose authority has been questioned by foreign invaders and domestic rebels alike. The sacred oils that will anoint Charles have been preserved through generations of political upheaval, waiting for this moment when divine intervention restores their proper function. Joan's role in the coronation ceremony transcends that of mere military escort, for she stands as the visible representative of heaven's favor that legitimizes the entire proceedings. Her presence beside the altar serves as tangible proof that God has chosen to intervene in earthly affairs through the most unlikely of instruments, validating royal claims that might otherwise appear as mere political assertions. The peasant girl who received her first visions in the meadows of Domremy has become the architect of monarchical restoration that operates through supernatural rather than conventional means. The ceremony itself unfolds with the magnificent pageantry that marks medieval attempts to make invisible realities visible through ritual action. As the Archbishop of Reims anoints Charles with oils that connect his kingship to divine authority, the transformation becomes palpable within the cathedral's sacred space. The uncertain prince who had hidden among his courtiers during Joan's arrival at Chinon emerges as Charles VII, King of France by divine right and heavenly sanction, his legitimacy no longer dependent upon military success or political maneuvering. Picture Joan as she witnesses this culmination of her divine mission, kneeling in her white armor before the altar where earthly authority receives heavenly validation. The saints, who first appeared to her in the fields of Domremy, have guided her steps to this moment. when their commands achieved fulfillment through human action that cooperates with divine purpose. Her banner, bearing the sacred names of Jesus and Mary, serves as visible reminder that temporal power finds its ultimate source in eternal authority that transcends all earthly opposition. The political implications of Charles's coronation extend far beyond the ceremonial splendor that fills Reims Cathedral, for this ritual transforms the strategic balance throughout medieval Europe. The prince, who had struggled to maintain his authority within diminished territories, has become a king whose legitimacy enjoys divine sanction, making continued resistance to his rule appear not merely treasonous but impious. Burgundian nobles who had justified their English alliances through claims about disputed succession now face the uncomfortable reality that heaven itself has resolved the dynastic questions that divided France against itself. As the coronation reaches its climax, with Charles receiving the crown that symbolizes his divinely sanctioned authority, the cathedral erupts in celebration that combines political triumph with religious ecstasy. The bells of Reims ring out across the Champagne countryside, their bronze voices proclaiming that France has finally received the legitimate king for whom it has waited through decades of foreign domination and civil discord. Joan's mission has achieved its primary objective through means that demonstrate the superiority of divine intervention over human political calculation. Yet even in this moment of supreme triumph, Joan understands that her work remains incomplete, for the English armies still occupy vast territories throughout northern France, while Paris itself remains under foreign control. The coronation at Reims has provided France with legitimate royal authority, but translating that spiritual victory into complete territorial liberation will require continued military action, under circumstances that may prove more challenging than the miraculous campaigns that brought them to this sacred moment. The newly crowned King Charles VII emerges from Reims Cathedral as a transformed figure, his bearing reflecting the confidence that comes from divine validation rather than mere human ambition. Joan rides beside him as they prepare to leave this holy city, her white armor still gleaming with the favor that has carried them through impossible victories, her banner still proclaiming the sacred names that have guided France from the darkness of foreign domination toward the light of restored independence. The bells of Reims still echo across the Champagne countryside when the first shadows begin to gather around Joan's divine mission, for the very completeness of her triumph at the coronation creates new complexities that threaten to undermine the supernatural momentum that has carried French forces from victory to miraculous victory. King Charles VII emerges from the cathedral as a transformed figure, his authority now sanctified by ancient rituals that connect earthly rule to heavenly mandate. Yet, this spiritual elevation introduces political considerations that operate according to different laws than those governing Joan's campaigns of liberation. Picture the royal court as it departs from Reims, its composition subtly altered by the presence of nobles and advisors who had maintained cautious distance during the uncertain months before the coronation, but now seek positions of influence near a king whose legitimacy enjoys divine validation. These courtiers bring with them the accumulated wisdom of political survival, learned through decades of French weakness. Their counsel shaped by pragmatic considerations that view Joan's supernatural successes with a mixture of gratitude and unease. The transformation becomes visible in the strategic discussions that follow the army's departure from the coronation city, as voices emerge advocating for diplomatic solutions to problems that Joan believes require continued military action. Where the Maid sees English occupation of Paris as an affront to divine justice that demands immediate rectification, experienced counselors perceive opportunities for negotiation that might achieve French objectives without the risks inherent in further battlefield confrontations. The very success of Joan's mission has created a king strong enough to consider alternatives to the total war that brought him to power. Charles himself embodies these competing impulses, torn between loyalty to the maiden who has restored his crown and the practical necessities of governing a kingdom that remains partially occupied by foreign armies. His coronation has solved the crisis of legitimacy that paralyzed French resistance for years, but transforming spiritual authority into effective political control requires skills different from those that achieve miraculous military victories. The king finds himself caught between Joan's divine certainty and his advisor's worldly wisdom, forced to navigate between heavenly commands and earthly realities. The first serious test of this evolving dynamic emerges through the question of Paris, that great city whose submission would complete the work of liberation begun at Orléans and continued through the Loire campaign. Joan views the capital's continued occupation by English and Burgundian forces as a stain upon French honor that heaven demands she remove through the same decisive action that has characterized all her previous campaigns. Her divine guides speak to her with unchanged clarity about the necessity of completing France's liberation, their voices carrying the same authority that first called her from the meadows of Domremy. Yet the military situation around Paris presents challenges that differ fundamentally from those Joan has previously encountered, for this massive city enjoys defensive advantages that make it virtually impregnable to conventional assault. The walls that protect the capital rise like stone mountains from the surrounding plains, their height and thickness representing centuries of accumulated engineering expertise designed to resist the most determined siege efforts. English and Burgundian commanders have had months to prepare their defenses, positioning artillery and organizing supplies in ways that make their position seemingly unassailable. More significantly, the political implications of an assault on Paris extend far beyond military considerations, for the city's capture through violent means would disrupt delicate negotiations that Charles's advisors have initiated with Burgundian representatives. Duke Philip the Good, whose alliance with England has provided the invaders with their most valuable continental support, has begun to signal potential willingness to reconsider his position in light of Joan's victories and Charles's coronation. These diplomatic overtures offer the tantalizing possibility of achieving through negotiation what might cost thousands of lives if pursued through military action. Joan's response to these political calculations reveals the fundamental tension between divine mission and earthly statecraft that increasingly characterizes her position within the royal court. She listens to the arguments advanced by Charles's counselors with the patience of someone whose certainty rests on supernatural foundations, but her replies demonstrate that heaven's commands admit no compromise with considerations of diplomatic convenience. The saints have shown her that France's liberation requires complete victory over foreign occupation, and human wisdom cannot alter divine imperatives through clever negotiation. The assault on Paris begins on September 8, 1429, the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, with Joan leading forces that advance against defensive positions prepared by some of Europe's most experienced military engineers. Picture her riding toward the capital's walls in her white armor, now bearing the scars of previous battles, but still gleaming with divine favor. Her sacred banner streaming above an army whose confidence remains unshaken despite the formidable obstacles that await their assault. Yet something has changed in the supernatural atmosphere that surrounds Joan's military operations, as if the very completeness of her success at Reims has altered the celestial dynamics that previously ensured French victory against impossible odds. The arrows and crossbow bolts that rained down from Paris's walls no longer seem to avoid her armored figure with the miraculous precision that characterized her earlier campaigns, while the defensive fire from English artillery achieves accuracy that should have been impossible given the providential protection she had previously enjoyed. The crucial moment arrives when a crossbow bolt, fired from the ramparts of the Porte Saint-André, pierces Joan's thigh with force that sends her tumbling from her horse onto ground already slick with the blood of French casualties. This wound, more serious than the shoulder injuries she sustained at Orléans, marks the first time since beginning her public mission that Joan has been seriously incapacitated by enemy action. The sight of their divinely protected leader, lying wounded and vulnerable, sends shockwaves through the assault force that threaten to transform tactical setback into catastrophic rout. Joan's response to this crisis demonstrates both her unchanged courage and the subtle alterations that have begun to affect her supernatural protection. She insists on continuing the assault despite her wound, calling upon her followers to maintain their attack against walls that remain stubbornly unbreached, despite hours of desperate effort. Yet her voice lacks the absolute certainty that had characterized her previous battlefield commands, as if doubt has begun to creep into consciousness that had previously known only divine assurance. The failure at Paris represents more than a military defeat. It constitutes the first visible crack in the wall of supernatural invincibility that has surrounded Joan since her arrival at Chinon. French soldiers, who had grown accustomed to miraculous victories, find themselves confronting the harsh realities of conventional warfare, where superior defensive positions and concentrated firepower determine outcomes rather than divine intervention. The psychological impact of this reversal spreads through the army like plague, undermining confidence that had seemed as solid as cathedral foundations. King Charles's response to the failed assault reveals the extent to which political considerations have begun to overshadow military imperatives in royal policy formation. Rather than authorizing continued attempts to capture Paris through force, he chooses to withdraw his armies and pursue the diplomatic initiatives that his advisors have recommended as alternatives to costly siege warfare. This decision represents the first clear instance of royal authority overruling Joan's divine commands, establishing a precedent that will increasingly characterize their future relationship. The withdrawal from Paris marks the beginning of Joan's gradual isolation within a court that has achieved its primary objectives through her miraculous interventions, but now seeks to consolidate those gains through conventional political means. Nobles, who had embraced her divine mission during the desperate months before the coronation, begin to view her continued insistence on total war as potentially destabilizing to the careful balance of negotiations and alliances that Charles's diplomats have constructed since Reims. Joan finds herself increasingly confined to ceremonial roles that honor her past achievements while limiting her influence over future policy decisions. The king continues to treat her with the respect due to heaven's chosen instrument, but their private conversations reveal growing divergence between her divine imperatives and his political necessities. Where she sees unfinished work that demands continued military action, he perceives opportunities for consolidating royal authority through patient diplomacy rather than risky battlefield adventures. The most painful aspect of this transformation involves the gradual reduction in resources allocated to military operations under Joan's direct command. The army that had grown through successive victories now shrinks as units are reassigned to garrison duties or diplomatic escorts, while supplies of equipment and provisions decline in proportion to the court's shifting priorities. Joan watches helplessly as the instrument of liberation that heaven had placed in her hands dissolves through political decisions that prioritize immediate stability over complete victory. Her desperate attempts to maintain military momentum despite these obstacles reveal both her unchanged dedication to divine mission and her growing understanding that earthly success can create its own forms of spiritual opposition. The nobles who benefit from Charles's diplomatic initiatives have invested too heavily in negotiated solutions to welcome renewed warfare that might disrupt their carefully constructed arrangements. Joan's very presence serves as an uncomfortable reminder that their political accommodations rest on foundations of compromise rather than complete justice. The winter of 1429 to 1430 finds Joan in the unprecedented position of possessing divine authorization for missions that lack adequate earthly support, her supernatural calling increasingly disconnected from the practical resources necessary to fulfill heaven's commands. She continues to receive visions from Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine, but their messages now carry undertones of urgency mixed with sorrow. as if the celestial realm recognizes that human politics have begun to interfere with providential plans for French liberation. The tragic irony of Joan's situation becomes most visible during the court's Christmas celebrations at Jargeau, where she sits among nobles whose prosperity depends upon her previous victories, while they advocate for policies that effectively abandon the divine mission that made their security possible. The peasant girl who had saved France from foreign domination now finds herself isolated within the very court she had restored to power, her supernatural gifts increasingly viewed as obstacles to the diplomatic compromises that conventional wisdom deems necessary for lasting peace. Yet, Joan's response to this growing isolation reveals the spiritual maturity that has developed through her encounters with both divine favor and human betrayal. Rather than abandoning her mission in response to reduced support, she begins to understand that heaven's plans may require her to accept suffering as well as triumph, that divine purposes sometimes work through apparent failure as effectively as through miraculous success. The saints prepare her for trials ahead while assuring her that God's justice operates according to timescales that transcend immediate political calculations. As winter deepens into the early months of 1413, Joan prepares for what she increasingly understands may be the final phase of her earthly mission, one that will require all the courage and faith she can summon while operating without the massive support that had characterized her earlier campaigns. The divine calling that first spoke to her in the meadows of Domremy continues to burn within her heart, but she now recognizes that following heaven's commands may demand sacrifices that extend beyond military casualties to encompass the loss of everything she has gained through miraculous intervention. The spring of 1430 finds Joan increasingly removed from the councils where her voice had once carried the authority of heaven itself. Yet the divine fire that first spoke to her in the meadows of Domremy continues to burn with undiminished intensity within her heart. While King Charles consolidates his diplomatic gains through careful negotiations that promise gradual recovery of French territories without the risks inherent in continued warfare, she receives visions that speak with growing urgency about unfinished work that heaven still requires her to accomplish. The saints who have guided her through miraculous victories now prepare her for trials that will test her faith in ways that battlefield courage cannot encompass. Picture Joan as she stands in the courtyard of whatever castle currently houses the royal entourage, her white armor still gleaming, despite the scars it bears from previous campaigns, her eyes fixed on horizons that others cannot see, while she listens to celestial voices that speak of French cities still groaning under foreign occupation. The political wisdom that governs courtly deliberations may have declared her military mission complete, but divine commands recognize no such human limitations. The Maid of Orleans understands that her true work will remain unfinished so long as a single French village remains under English or Burgundian control. The news that reaches court in early May carries reports of Burgundian forces besieging Compiègne, a strategic city whose location along the Oise River makes it crucial for maintaining communication between Paris and the remaining French territories in the north. Duke Philip the Good has assigned this operation to John of Luxembourg, one of his most capable commanders, whose methodical approach to siege warfare threatens to reduce this important stronghold through the same systematic pressure that has delivered so many French cities to foreign control over the decades of seemingly endless conflict. Joan's response to this intelligence reveals the extent to which her priorities have diverged from those that govern royal policy, for, where Charles's advisors see Compiègne's potential fall as a regrettable but acceptable loss in the larger game of diplomatic maneuvering, she perceives divine command to rescue French subjects who cry out for liberation. Her request for permission to lead a relief expedition meets with the polite resistance that has become characteristic of court responses to her military proposals, as counselors advance practical arguments about resource limitations and strategic priorities that effectively neutralize her supernatural calling. Yet Joan has learned to distinguish between human authorization and heavenly imperative, understanding that divine missions sometimes require action that transcends earthly approval. In late May, she departs from court with a small force of volunteers who remain loyal to her person, rather than to the cautious policies that now characterize royal strategy. This expedition represents more than military disobedience. It constitutes an act of faith that places divine commands above human calculations, regardless of the personal consequences that such choices might entail. The ride toward Compiègne carries Joan through countryside that shows the complex patterns of loyalty and occupation that characterize northeastern France in this period of gradual transition. Villages that had welcomed her triumphant armies during the march to Reims now watch nervously as her reduced force passes through territories where Burgundian patrols operate with increasing boldness. The transformation in local attitudes reflects the broader shift in political momentum that has occurred since the failed assault on Paris, as populations that had briefly hoped for complete liberation now accommodate themselves to the reality of continued foreign presence. Compiègne itself presents a picture of determined resistance that recalls the early days of Joan's mission, when French strongholds stood alone against overwhelming enemy forces while waiting for relief that conventional wisdom insisted could never arrive. The city's walls bear the scars of Burgundian bombardment, while smoke from enemy campfires creates a haze that obscures the surrounding countryside like a physical manifestation of the uncertainty that envelops this final phase of Joan's public career. Within these defenses, French soldiers and civilians maintain their vigil with the desperate courage of those who understand that surrender means more than military defeat. Joan's arrival at Compiègne on May 14th rekindles the spark of hope that her presence has ignited in so many besieged cities, yet something in the atmosphere differs from the supernatural confidence that had characterized her previous rescue operations. The garrison greets her with genuine enthusiasm, but their faces reflect awareness that this small relief force lacks the overwhelming strength that had made her earlier victories seem inevitable. The white-armored maiden who enters their gates remains as determined as ever, but she no longer commands the massive royal armies that had swept English forces from the Loire Valley. The siege itself reveals John of Luxembourg as a commander who has studied Joan's previous methods and adapted his tactics accordingly. Rather than concentrating his forces in easily identified positions that French sorties might overwhelm through surprise assault, he deploys his troops in flexible formations that can respond quickly to threats while maintaining sufficient dispersion to avoid the psychological collapse that had characterized English defeats at Orléans and Patay. His Burgundian soldiers, fighting in territories they consider their own, demonstrate morale that contrasts sharply with the demoralization that had afflicted English armies when confronted by Joan's supernatural protection. The fateful sortie that seals Joan's fate begins in the early afternoon of May 23, 1430, with intelligence suggesting that Burgundian forces have temporarily weakened their grip on the approaches to Compiègne's main gate. Picture Joan as she leads this assault, her sacred banner streaming above a force that combines professional soldiers with local volunteers, whose knowledge of the surrounding terrain provides crucial advantages for operations conducted in familiar country. The attack achieves initial success, driving Burgundian outposts back from their advanced positions while opening corridors that might allow additional supplies to reach the besieged city. Yet the very success of this operation triggers the trap that John of Luxembourg has carefully prepared, as Burgundian reserves emerge from concealed positions to encircle French forces that have advanced too far from their defensive base. The tactical situation deteriorates with frightening speed, as Joan finds her small army caught between converging enemy columns that threaten to cut off their retreat to Compiègne's protecting walls. The supernatural protection that had preserved her through countless previous engagements seems absent from this crucial moment, leaving her dependent upon merely human resources against opponents who have learned to anticipate her methods. The moment of capture unfolds with the terrible inevitability that marks those instances when divine plans intersect with human limitations in ways that transcend immediate understanding. As Joan attempts to cover the retreat of her followers, her horse stumbles under the weight of enemy pressure, sending her tumbling to earth, where Burgundian soldiers swarm over her before she can regain her footing. The white armor that had gleamed like an angel's protection throughout her miraculous career now becomes a liability that makes escape impossible, marking her for capture by enemies who recognize the immense value of their prize. Picture the shock that spreads through French ranks as word passes that their divinely protected leader has fallen into enemy hands, transforming tactical retreat into something approaching panic as soldiers struggle to comprehend how heaven's chosen instrument could suffer such catastrophic reversal. The banner bearing the sacred names of Jesus and Mary falls to Burgundian hands, along with the maiden who had carried it to impossible victories, creating a symbolic defeat that resonates far beyond the immediate military implications of losing a single commander. John of Luxembourg's treatment of his extraordinary prisoner reveals both the respect that Joan's reputation commands and the political calculations that will determine her ultimate fate. Rather than executing her immediately as a dangerous enemy, he recognizes that her capture represents a diplomatic asset whose value extends far beyond normal military considerations. The peasant girl who has challenged the foundations of English dominance in France becomes a bargaining chip in negotiations that will determine not only her personal destiny, but the broader question of how divine authority relates to earthly political arrangements. The news of Joan's capture spreads across medieval Europe with the speed that attends events of truly historic significance, carrying different meanings to different audiences, but universally recognized as marking a crucial turning point in the long struggle between France and England. In London, English officials celebrate what they perceive as divine judgment against French claims to supernatural favor, while in Paris, Burgundian authorities debate how best to exploit their unexpected windfall. Throughout the territories that Joan had liberated, populations that had begun to hope for permanent freedom now face the terrifying possibility that their salvation has proven temporary. Yet perhaps the most profound impact occurs within the diminished French court, where Charles must confront the implications of losing the maiden whose miraculous interventions had restored his crown and kingdom. The political wisdom that had counseled caution now appears tragically vindicated, while those who had supported Joan's continued military activities face uncomfortable questions about the consequences of encouraging divine missions that exceed available earthly resources. The king finds himself caught between loyalty to his savior and the practical necessities of governing a realm that must survive regardless of individual faiths. The negotiations that lead to Joan's sale to English authorities for £10,000 reveal the extent to which political considerations have come to overshadow the religious implications of her mission. Duke Philip the Good, whose Burgundian forces accomplished her capture, views this transaction primarily as an opportunity to strengthen his alliance with England, while removing a dangerous source of French military inspiration. The peasant girl who had claimed heaven's authorization becomes a commodity in diplomatic exchanges that treat divine calling as merely another factor in the complex calculations that govern medieval statecraft. As summer deepens into autumn, Joan remains imprisoned in various Burgundian strongholds while her captors negotiate the terms of her transfer to English custody. The white armor that had protected her through countless battles now hangs unused in castle chambers, while the maiden who had worn it contemplates a future that heaven has shown her but that human understanding cannot fully grasp. The divine voices that first called her from obscurity continue to speak, preparing her for trials that will test faith in ways that military combat never could, ensuring that her true victory will transcend any earthly defeat that enemies might inflict upon her mortal flesh. The cold stones of Rouen Castle close around Joan like the walls of a tomb as winter settles over Normandy in December of 1430, bringing with it the chill that penetrates more than flesh and bone, to touch the very soul of one whose divine mission has led inexorably to this moment of supreme testing. The fortress that now serves as her prison rises from the Seine's dark waters like a monument to English determination to break not merely French military resistance, but the spiritual foundations upon which that resistance has rested, since Joan's miraculous appearance transformed the character of their ancient conflict. Picture the cell where England's most dangerous prisoner spends her days and nights, a chamber whose narrow window offers glimpses of the city beyond these walls, where English administrators and their Norman collaborators conduct the business of governing territories conquered through force of arms, but never truly possessed in the hearts of their subject populations. The sounds that drift through these stone barriers carry reminders of a world that continues despite her captivity. Market vendors calling their wares, church bells marking the canonical hours, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones as messengers carry news across an empire that stretches from London to the edges of territories she had liberated for France. Yet Joan's captivity represents more than mere military imprisonment, for her English captors understand that they hold in their hands someone whose very existence challenges the fundamental assumptions upon which their conquest of France has been based. The peasant girl who claims divine authorization for driving foreign armies from French soil poses threats that extend far beyond her personal military capabilities, threatening to undermine English rule through the simple fact of her continued existence as a living symbol of French resistance, blessed by heaven itself. The decision to try Joan for heresy rather than execute her immediately as a captured enemy reveals the sophisticated understanding that English authorities possess regarding the theological dimensions of their political predicament. Simply killing her would create a martyr whose death might inspire renewed French resistance for generations, while allowing her to live would permit continued challenges to English legitimacy that rest on claims of divine favor. Only by proving her a heretic condemned by proper ecclesiastical authority can they hope to destroy both her person and the supernatural claims that have made her so dangerous to their interests. The ecclesiastical court that assembles in Rouen during the early months of 1431 represents one of the most formidable gatherings of medieval legal and theological expertise ever convened for a single case, its membership carefully selected to ensure conclusions that will serve English political interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious judgment. Pierre Carton, the ambitious Bishop of Beauvais, whose own territories have fallen under French control, presides over proceedings that combine genuine theological inquiry with predetermined political objectives in ways that illuminate the complex relationships between spiritual authority and earthly power. Picture the great hall where these learned men gather to examine a peasant girl whose education extends no further than basic Christian doctrine learned in her village church, their academic degrees and ecclesiastical honors arrayed against someone whose only claim to authority rests on direct divine revelation that bypasses all institutional mediation. The University of Paris has provided assessors whose theological training encompasses the accumulated wisdom of centuries, while canon lawyers bring expertise in church law that should easily expose any deception in Joan's supernatural claims. Yet, something in her presence unsettles these confident scholars, as if they sense that conventional learning may prove inadequate to the extraordinary case that confronts them. The trial begins on February 21st, 1431, with preliminary proceedings that reveal immediately the fundamental tension between institutional authority and individual revelation that will characterize all subsequent interactions between Joan and her judges. When asked to swear an oath to answer truthfully all questions that may be posed to her, she responds with the careful precision of someone whose loyalties transcend earthly courts. "I do not know what you wish to examine me on. You might put such questions that I would not tell you the truth." Her qualification demonstrates understanding that divine secrets cannot be subjected to human judicial inquiry, regardless of the authority that demands such revelation. The months of interrogation that follow create a detailed record of medieval Christianity's encounter with someone who claims direct access to heavenly guidance, as learned theologians probe every aspect of Joan's spiritual experiences while seeking evidence of delusion or demonic deception that would justify condemnation. Yet the trial transcripts reveal repeatedly that this unlettered peasant girl possesses theological sophistication that confounds her educated interrogators, responding to complex doctrinal questions with insights that transcend formal academic training while remaining perfectly orthodox in their fundamental orientation. When questioned about the nature of her voices, Joan responds with the matter-of-fact precision of someone describing conversations with living friends. The voice was beautiful, honorable, and worthy, and I believe firmly that it was Saint Michael who appeared to me. Her detailed descriptions of the archangel's appearance, including his wings and the company of angels that accompanied him, provide specificity that indicates either genuine supernatural experience or imaginative powers that approach the miraculous in their own right. The political implications of her mission receive extensive examination as the court seeks to demonstrate that Joan's actions constitute rebellion against legitimate authority rather than obedience to divine commands. Yet, her responses reveal understanding of political theology that would credit trained scholars. I was sent by God to drive the English out of France and to have the Dauphin crowned at Reims. This is why I came. When pressed about whether God hates the English, she responds with careful distinction. Of God's love or hate for the English I know nothing, but I know well that they will be driven out of France except those who die there. Her defense of wearing male clothing produces some of the trial's most revealing exchanges. As ecclesiastical law forbids such practices, while Joan's mission requires appearance that allows her to function effectively in military environments. The dress is a small, nay, the least thing, she declares with characteristic directness. Nor did I put it on by the advice of any man whatsoever. I did not put on this dress, nor do anything but by the command of God and the angels. Her reasoning demonstrates understanding that divine commands can supersede human regulations when supernatural purposes require exceptional measures. The examination of Joan's theological knowledge reveals repeatedly that this unlettered peasant possesses insights into divine mysteries that surpass those achieved through years of academic study. When questioned about the state of her soul, she responds with the precision of a trained theologian. If I am not in God's grace, may God bring me to it. If I am in it, may God keep me there. I should be the most wretched creature in the world if I were not in the grace of God. Such responses demonstrate a spiritual sophistication that her interrogators find difficult to reconcile with her humble origins and complete lack of formal education. The court's attempts to trap Joan through complex theological questions produce exchanges that illuminate the gulf between academic learning and authentic spiritual experience. When asked whether Saint Michael appeared to her naked, she responds with gentle mockery, "Do you think God has not wherewithal to clothe him?" Her ability to deflect sophisticated theological attacks while maintaining essential simplicity reveals wisdom that flows from sources beyond human instruction, confounding scholars who had expected to expose rustic ignorance through learned interrogation. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Joan's defense involves her unwavering insistence that earthly courts possess no authority to judge divine revelations that operate according to laws higher than those governing human institutions. I refer myself to God who sent me, to Our Lady, and to all the blessed saints in paradise, she declares when pressed to submit her case to the Church militant rather than the Church triumphant. This distinction demonstrates understanding of ecclesiastical theology that surpasses the knowledge of many among her judges, while establishing principles that protect individual revelation from institutional suppression. The political motivations that drive the trial become increasingly transparent as proceedings advance, revealing the extent to which theological accusations serve English interests rather than genuine religious concerns. Joan's continued existence threatens English rule, not through any military capability she retains while in prison, but through the simple fact that God's chosen instrument remains alive to contradict English claims about divine favor. Her judges seek condemnation that will retroactively delegitimize all her previous victories, transforming miraculous liberation into demonic deception through post hoc theological interpretation. Yet Joan's responses to political questions reveal sophisticated understanding of the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that confounds attempts to portray her as a simple tool of French political ambition. When asked whether she knew she was in God's grace at the time of her capture, she responds with theological precision that acknowledges human limitations while maintaining confidence in divine purpose. "If I was not, may God place me there. If I was, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I was not in the grace of God." The examination of her military activities produces testimony that inadvertently confirms the supernatural character of her achievements, as the court seeks evidence of sorcery while documenting miracles that transcend natural explanation. Joan's detailed accounts of her victories at Orléans, in the Loire campaign, and during the march to Reims provide military intelligence that demonstrates strategic genius incompatible with her background and training. Her ability to predict English movements, locate hidden weapons, and inspire impossible victories requires explanation that the court struggles to provide without acknowledging divine intervention. The theological implications of Joan's case create profound difficulties for judges who must condemn someone whose orthodoxy appears unquestionable, while whose claims to divine revelation challenge institutional authority. Her responses to doctrinal questions reveal deep understanding of Christian teaching that makes charges of heresy difficult to sustain, while her moral character appears to transcend the normal human frailties that typically provide grounds for ecclesiastical condemnation. The court finds itself prosecuting someone whose primary offense consists of claiming direct access to God that bypasses official church mediation. As winter gives way to spring, the trial's proceedings reveal the fundamental incompatibility between institutional Christianity and authentic mystical experience, as learned judges struggle to find grounds for condemning someone whose spiritual life surpasses their own in depth and authenticity. Joan's continued insistence that her voices speak with divine authority creates an impasse that cannot be resolved through normal theological reasoning, forcing the court to choose between acknowledging genuine revelation and maintaining institutional supremacy. The political pressure that surrounds these proceedings becomes increasingly evident as English authorities demand conclusions that serve their strategic interests, regardless of theological merit. Cardinal Beaufort and other English representatives attend sessions where they observe proceedings that must produce Joan's condemnation if English rule in France is to maintain legitimacy. The judges find themselves caught between scholarly integrity and political necessity, forced to reach conclusions that satisfy earthly masters while preserving their own ecclesiastical authority. Joan's physical condition deteriorates under the stress of prolonged imprisonment and constant interrogation, yet her spiritual resolve remains unshaken as she faces opponents whose learning cannot overcome the simple fact of her divine calling. The cold stones of Rouen Castle and the complex arguments of trained theologians prove equally incapable of breaking faith that rests on foundations more solid than human wisdom or institutional authority. The trial transcripts preserve for history the remarkable spectacle of medieval Christianity's most learned representatives struggling unsuccessfully to refute claims made by an illiterate peasant girl whose only authority derives from direct divine revelation. Joan's responses demonstrate that authentic spiritual experience possesses power that transcends all earthly opposition, while her judges reveal the limitations of purely institutional religion when confronted by genuine mystical encounter with divine truth. As the proceedings move toward their predetermined conclusion, Joan maintains the same unwavering certainty that characterized her arrival at Chinon and her victories at Orléans, understanding that human courts cannot invalidate divine commands, regardless of the sentences they may pronounce. The peasant girl who received her first visions in the meadows of Domremy prepares to face whatever judgment earthly authority may impose, while trusting in higher courts whose justice operates according to eternal rather than temporal standards. The verdict that emerges from months of theological examination carries the weight of predetermined conclusion, disguised as scholarly deliberation, as the ecclesiastical court at Rouen pronounces Joan guilty of heresy, idolatry, and relapse into error, despite testimony that revealed spiritual sophistication surpassing that of her learned judges. The sentence of death by burning reflects not theological necessity but political expediency, designed to destroy both Joan's person and the dangerous claims to divine favor that have made her such a potent symbol of French resistance to English rule. Yet, even in this moment of apparent triumph for her enemies, something in Joan's demeanor suggests that earthly courts cannot touch the essential reality of her divine mission, as if she understands truths about eternal justice that transcend the temporal punishments human authority can inflict. Picture her as she stands before judges whose learning encompasses centuries of accumulated theological wisdom, yet whose understanding cannot penetrate the mystery of authentic divine revelation that operates through the most unlikely of instruments. The brief episode of her recantation on May 24th reveals the profound humanity that has always characterized Joan's responses to impossible situations, as the girl who had fearlessly faced English armies finds herself momentarily overwhelmed by the prospect of death by fire. In the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, surrounded by crowds that have gathered to witness either her execution or her submission, she signs a document renouncing her voices and accepting the authority of the church militant over her individual revelations. This moment of weakness, far from diminishing her stature, emphasizes the genuine courage required for her subsequent withdrawal of this renunciation, when divine truth reasserts its claims upon her conscience. The return to her cell after this public humiliation brings Joan face to face with the fundamental choice that has defined her entire mission, whether to preserve earthly life through compromise with human authority or to maintain fidelity to divine commands regardless of personal consequences. The saints who first appeared to her in the meadows of Domremy speak with renewed clarity about the eternal significance of temporal choices, preparing her for trials that will test faith in ways that battlefield courage never could. Saint Michael's voice carries the same authority that first called her from obscurity, while Saints Margaret and Catherine offer the gentle strength of those who have themselves chosen martyrdom over apostasy. Her decision to withdraw the recantation and resume wearing male clothing signals more than mere return to previous positions. It represents a final affirmation of divine calling that transcends all earthly considerations. When her guards discover her dressed again in the forbidden garments that symbolize her military mission, they understand that the brief respite of her submission has ended and that she has chosen the path that leads inevitably to the marketplace stake. Joan's explanation remains characteristically direct. My voices have told me that I did very wrong to confess that what I had done was not well done. What I said and revoked, I said for fear of the fire. The final week of her earthly life unfolds within the confines of Rouen Castle as English authorities prepare for an execution that must serve multiple purposes simultaneously, eliminating a dangerous enemy, discrediting French claims to divine favor, and demonstrating English determination to suppress any challenges to their rule in conquered territories. Yet even these practical considerations cannot entirely explain the elaborate precautions taken to ensure that Joan's death produces the desired political effects, rather than creating a martyrdom that might inspire renewed resistance. Picture Joan during these last days as she maintains the same quiet dignity that characterized her appearance before kings and her leadership of armies, her faith unshaken by the approaching ordeal that awaits in Rouen's marketplace. The cell that confines her body cannot imprison the spirit that has already transcended earthly limitations, while the chains that bind her physically serve only to emphasize the freedom that flows from complete surrender to divine will. Her conversations with sympathetic clergy reveal understanding of eternal truths that surpasses theological learning as she prepares for reunion with the saints who have guided her through triumph and tribulation alike. The morning of May 30th, 1431 dawns grey and overcast, as if the very heavens weep for the injustice about to unfold in the ancient marketplace, where merchants have sold their wares for centuries, while ordinary citizens have witnessed the public ceremonies that mark the rhythms of medieval urban life. Today, this familiar space will host an event whose significance transcends local boundaries, as divine mission encounters human opposition in a final confrontation that will illuminate eternal truths about justice and sacrifice. Joan's journey from castle cell to marketplace stake covers a distance measurable in yards, yet represents a passage from earthly conflict to heavenly vindication, as she walks through streets lined with crowds whose reactions range from hostile satisfaction to profound sympathy. Her appearance surprises those who expected to see a broken prisoner, for she maintains the same composure that characterized her arrival at Chinon and her victories at Orléans, as if approaching not execution, but coronation, in a kingdom whose values transcend those governing temporal realms. The wooden platform that rises from the marketplace goans bears the instruments of execution, designed to serve as both punishment and public spectacle, its height ensuring that spectators throughout the square can witness proceedings that English authorities intend as demonstration of their power over those who challenge their rule. Yet something in Joan's bearing transforms this intended humiliation into testimony that divine truth cannot be destroyed through human violence, regardless of the earthly authority that commands such destruction. Her final request reveals the essential simplicity that has always characterized her spiritual life, as she asks for a cross to be held before her eyes during the ordeal that awaits. This symbol of divine love and sacrifice becomes the focus of her attention as flames begin to rise around the stake, connecting her suffering to the eternal pattern of redemption that gives meaning to all temporal pain. The wooden cross that a sympathetic English soldier fashions from broken sticks serves as tangible reminder that God's presence transcends the hatred of those who seek to destroy his chosen instruments. The execution itself unfolds with terrible efficiency, yet witnesses record phenomena that suggest supernatural intervention in the midst of human cruelty. Joan's voice rises above the crackling flames as she calls repeatedly upon the name of Jesus, her words carrying across the marketplace with clarity that seems impossible given the circumstances of her death. The smoke that rises from the pyre forms patterns that several observers describe as miraculous, while her final cry of "Jesus" echoes through Rouen streets with force that penetrates hearts hardened by years of warfare and occupation. The immediate aftermath of her execution reveals the profound impact that Joan's death has upon witnesses, who came expecting to see justice done against a heretic, but find themselves confronted by martyrdom that challenges their fundamental assumptions about divine favor and earthly authority. English soldiers who had participated in the proceedings speak quietly among themselves about signs they have witnessed, while French citizens who had maintained careful neutrality during the occupation begin to question whether heaven truly supports the foreign rule they have accepted as inevitable. The elaborate measures taken to prevent the collection of relics demonstrate English understanding that Joan's death threatens to create exactly the kind of martyrdom they had sought to avoid through the theological proceedings at Rouen. Her ashes are gathered with meticulous care and scattered in the Seine, while guards search the marketplace for any fragment of bone or cloth that might serve as focus for future veneration. Yet, these precautions prove insufficient to contain the spiritual forces that her sacrifice has unleashed, as stories of her final moments spread across France with the speed that attends genuinely miraculous events. The psychological impact of Joan's execution extends far beyond Rouen marketplace to shake the foundations of English rule throughout their French territories, as populations that had learned to accept foreign occupation begin to question whether heaven truly favors the cause that has required such drastic measures to silence its opposition. The peasant girl whose divine mission challenged the legitimacy of English conquest has achieved through her death what her life had begun: the restoration of French confidence in divine justice that transcends earthly political arrangements. Yet perhaps the most significant consequence of Joan's martyrdom involves the transformation it works within the consciousness of those who witness her final testimony, as even her enemies find themselves confronted by evidence of spiritual reality that challenges their materialistic assumptions about power and authority. The English soldier who provided her cross speaks afterward of visions he experienced during the execution, while several members of the ecclesiastical court privately expressed doubts about the proceedings they had conducted with such scholarly confidence. The official records of Joan's execution preserve for history the remarkable spectacle of institutional authority destroying someone whose only crime consisted of claiming direct access to divine truth. Yet, these same documents inadvertently testify to the spiritual power that transcends all earthly opposition. The careful Latin phrases that describe her death cannot capture the supernatural atmosphere that witnesses describe, as if language itself proves inadequate to convey the full significance of what they have observed. As evening shadows fall across Rouen marketplace, where the ashes of God's chosen instrument have been scattered to prevent their veneration, the city settles into an uneasy quiet that reflects awareness that something irreversible has occurred within the moral order of the universe. The English authorities, who planned this execution as demonstration of their power, have instead provided testimony to divine justice that operates according to laws higher than those governing earthly kingdoms. The peasant girl who received her first visions in the meadows of Domremy has completed her earthly mission, not through military victory, but through faithful witness unto death, trusting in divine promises that transcend human understanding, while demonstrating that authentic spiritual authority cannot be destroyed by those who possess only temporal power. Her final prayer echoes across centuries as testimony that divine love proves stronger than human hatred, while her sacrifice illuminates eternal truths about justice and redemption that transform apparent defeat into ultimate victory. The silence that settles over Rouen's marketplace in the aftermath of Joan's execution carries within it seeds of transformation that will reshape the very foundations upon which her enemies have built their claims to divine favor. For the ashes scattered in the Seine's dark waters cannot contain the spiritual forces that martyrdom has released into the currents of human history. 25 years pass like the turning of seasons before the full magnitude of what has occurred begins to manifest through earthly institutions. Yet the invisible work of vindication proceeds according to celestial timescales that measure justice in epochs rather than the brief spans that govern mortal understanding. Picture the Great Hall in Rouen, where a new tribunal assembles in 1455, its membership drawn from the highest ranks of ecclesiastical authority, yet gathering not to condemn, but to rehabilitate the memory of one whose death has haunted the conscience of Christendom for a quarter century. Pope Calixtus III has authorized these proceedings at the request of King Charles VII, whose crown still bears the legitimacy that Joan's sacrifice helped to secure, while her mother Isabel, now aged beyond her years by grief and vindication deferred, watches learned judges reverse the verdict that had sent her daughter to the flame. The rehabilitation trial unfolds through testimony that transforms Joan's story from the record of a condemned heretic into the biography of a saint, as witnesses who had known her during her brief public life speak truths that political necessity had previously suppressed. Former soldiers described miraculous events they witnessed during her campaigns, while clergy who had examined her at Poitiers testify to the orthodox character of her revelations and the supernatural knowledge that had convinced them of her divine mission. The peasants of Domremy recalled the exceptional piety of the girl who had tended sheep among them, their simple words carrying more weight than the elaborate theological arguments that had characterized the original proceedings. The verdict that emerges from this careful examination declares Joan innocent of all charges brought against her, pronouncing her a martyr whose death resulted from the malice of her enemies rather than any fault in her character or mission. Yet this legal vindication, important as it proves for restoring her reputation among the learned, represents only the beginning of a transformation that extends far beyond the correction of judicial error to encompass the birth of a legend whose influence will transcend the boundaries of any single nation or epoch. In the decades that follow her rehabilitation, Joan's memory begins to work its way into the deeper currents of French consciousness, becoming not merely a historical figure whose achievements merit remembrance, but a symbol that embodies the eternal struggle between divine justice and earthly oppression. Her story spreads through the oral traditions that carry truth from generation to generation in forms that transcend written records, as grandmothers tell their grandchildren about the peasant girl who heard voices from heaven and saved France from foreign domination through faith stronger than any earthly power. The transformation accelerates as France itself evolves from medieval kingdom into modern nation, with each succeeding age discovering new meanings in Joan's example that speak to their particular circumstances, while illuminating universal truths about courage, sacrifice, and the relationship between individual calling and collective destiny. During the wars of religion that tear France apart in the 16th century, both Catholics and Protestants claim her memory as validation for their causes. Yet her essential message transcends sectarian divisions to speak of divine purpose that operates through humble instruments, chosen for their faithfulness rather than their theological sophistication. You can trace her influence through the centuries that follow, as writers and artists discover in Joan's story materials for exploring the deepest questions of human existence. Her brief life providing a lens through which successive generations examine their own struggles with faith, authority, and the demands of conscience. Shakespeare portrays her as a mysterious force that disrupts English confidence, while Voltaire treats her as a symbol of superstition overcome by Enlightenment reason. Yet both interpretations acknowledge the power of her example to challenge assumptions about the nature of truth and the sources of legitimate authority. The French Revolution discovers in Joan a predecessor whose resistance to corrupt authority validates their own rejection of institutions that have outlived their divine mandate, while Napoleon finds in her memory justification for his imperial ambitions disguised as liberation of oppressed peoples. Each political movement that claims her legacy reveals something of its own character while demonstrating the remarkable adaptability of a symbol that transcends the particular circumstances of its origin to speak to universal human aspirations for justice and freedom. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of Joan's enduring influence emerges through her appeal to those who find themselves caught between competing loyalties, forced to choose between earthly prudence and heavenly calling in situations where conventional wisdom offers no satisfactory guidance. Her example provides courage for countless individuals who must decide whether to remain silent in the face of injustice or speak truth regardless of personal consequences, demonstrating through her own sacrifice that divine purposes sometimes require actions that transcend normal calculations of success and failure. The formal recognition that arrives with her canonization as Saint Joan of Arc in 1920 represents institutional acknowledgement of what popular devotion had proclaimed for centuries, that the peasant girl who died in Rouen marketplace had achieved the kind of spiritual victory that transformed apparent defeat into eternal triumph. Yet this official approval, important as it proves for validating her place within Catholic tradition, cannot fully capture the broader significance of a life that speaks to human hearts, regardless of their particular religious affiliations or cultural backgrounds. Her story continues to resonate across cultures and continents, as successive generations discover in Joan's example inspiration for their own struggles against seemingly impossible odds, whether those battles involve resisting totalitarian oppression, challenging social injustice, or simply maintaining faith in divine purpose when earthly circumstances suggest that heaven has abandoned its creation to the forces of darkness. The voices that spoke to her in the meadows of Domremy echo through history as reminders that divine calling often comes to those whom worldly wisdom would never select, that God's purposes operate through instruments whose very inadequacy emphasizes the supernatural character of their achievements. As evening light fades across the Loire Valley where Joan won her greatest victories, as shadows gather over the cathedral at Reims, where she witnessed the coronation that validated her divine mission, as darkness settles over Rouen ancient marketplace, where her earthly life ended in flames that could not consume the eternal truth she embodied, her legacy continues to work its quiet transformation within the hearts of those who encounter her story. The white armor that once gleamed on medieval battlefields has long since crumbled to dust, yet the spiritual protection it symbolized endures as testimony that divine love proves stronger than human hatred, that authentic faith transcends every earthly opposition, that even the humblest soul, touched by grace and willing to follow heaven's calling regardless of personal cost, can change the world in ways that echo through eternity. The peasant girl from Domremy sleeps now in the silence of sanctity, her brief public life complete, her mission accomplished not through the victories that made her famous, but through the faithful witness that made her holy, her example continuing to inspire all who believe that divine justice will ultimately triumph over every earthly injustice, that truth will prevail over falsehood, that light will overcome darkness, and that love will prove stronger than death itself in the cosmic struggle that gives meaning to every human choice and dignity to every human sacrifice.